up, guys? This is a little update on my Turbo Ford 300. As you can see, got a broken ring lamp. Actually, it's all 6 of them that are broke, unfortunately. Why this happened, not exactly sure. Probably ring gap. That would be my only good guess. But as you can see here, this chunk is missing out of my piston. A lot of the pistons, they're not exactly broken, but they do have a crack on them, like they're about ready to come apart. So none of these pistons are any good anymore. As you can see, this ring actually broke into 3 or 4 pieces. Now I had these rings gapped at about 25 thousandths, and the book calls for about 20 thousandths. So I figured the extra 5 would be okay for boost. I was only planning to run about 6 or 7 pounds, ended up making around 10 pounds when this happened. But what actually happened was I got it fired up, got it to run right, and I had a little problem with the fitting on my oil pressure sensor here. This fitting right here, the one that I had on it, it actually broke. I went to leave my driveway and I didn't realize it had broken. And it was just shooting oil just all down the road and everything. I didn't know until I was about a block away, and I gave her some juice to get across the highway, and it started spinning the tires, and I knew that it wasn't good, because it normally wouldn't spin tires, and it was super low on oil, so I knew it was making a little bit more power than normal. So I pulled it over off to the side and got a tow home. No big deal. Put some more oil in it. Started it up, ran just fine. I was pretty surprised, but the oil that I run in it is actually Valvoline VR1 high zinc racing oil, and it's supposed to have extreme anti-wear protection. That's why I use it. I didn't really give it too many break-in miles, which I kind of regret, but it just gives me another chance to build it back up the way that I want. Another problem that I found was that I think I needed to move my oil drain for my turbo, because as you can see, it's a 5/8 oil return straight to the back of the pan here, but my turbo sits right about here, and so the line has to go all the way down here, turn, and then go in. And I found out that it was actually getting really hot by the header, and it had actually started to pinch it on the frame. And I was lucky enough that I had found that when I took it all apart. But after the oil pressure incident, after firing it back up, I let it idle and was working on my fans and my tune. And I let it sit in the yard and idle for about a half an hour or so, just to see what the new fans that I put in were going to do. And it was keeping it at 110 or 180, and then dropping it to 170. It'd rise to 180, drop to 170. So I knew that my fan was working well. And so I figured, okay, I'll take it out for a rip. Well, I went out for a rip, and my distributor was actually locked at about 10, 12 degrees of timing. I'm not sure why it was locked, but for some reason the micro squirt would not control the timing. And no matter what you did, the micro squirt would tell you that you're running like 15, 20 degrees of timing, whatever you actually put in the micro squirt, it would say you're running that. But when you look at the balancer, it was always at either 10 or 12. So I knew there was something wrong here. And don't mind this. This wasn't actually in use. That was just a little mock-up piece. And it was always saying 10 to 12 on the balancer, so I figured, okay, 10 to 12 degrees at all times, that can't really hurt much, I guess. I mean, some people say that it helps spool up a turbo. It did spool pretty quick. I don't know if that's because of how inefficient my header design was, or because of my actual turbo. It's not the biggest turbo. However, it's got the 2.5-inch outlet, and the inlet is actually 3-inch. So it's not a terribly small turbo. It's not a big Gary or anything. And I took it out for a rip, and it made 10 pounds, pretty solid. I cruised down to an idle, and I went to go turn around, not a U-turn, but turn around, and as soon as I was just sitting there idling, it just completely died. Like somebody shut off either fuel or spark. I was very, very confused at the time, and I had to get towed back home. Didn't know what was going on. Couldn't get it to run at all. It sounded like it just wasn't firing. Checked my spark plugs. I was getting fire. I was getting fuel. The only thing I wasn't sure was compression, because for the 300s they use a bigger spark plug than pretty much every other motor. And we don't have a compression fitting that's the right size. So we had to jerry rig one up. And after jerry rigging one up, we found out that the cylinders only had 50 to 90 compression, and that's when we knew that that was indeed the problem. Not knowing what it could have been, I figured maybe the rings just hadn't sealed because I didn't give it very much braking time, and when it did die, it didn't make any noticeable clangs or bangs or anything. There was no obvious sign that we broke a ringland, or actually all 6 rings, I should say, because it broke every single piston. Number 1, number 2, that's part of the ring. Number 3 broke the top ring. Piston number 4, it broke the ringland out like number 1. Piston 5, actually, this piece will not come out because the edge of the ringland behind the ring is actually broken, so it can't come out. And as you can see, there's a piece of the ring right there in the ringland. I thought I had enough ring gap in it, but I guess 25 thousandths wasn't enough, so I guess I'll have to try 30, I suppose. And being locked at 10-12 degrees of timing, I know it couldn't have been a timing issue that caused that. I do run an intercooler, so I know that my charge temps couldn't have been too high. It's questionable how long that they have been broken, because I was running without an intercooler for a while. But then I put the intercooler on and did all my boost pipes, and it seemed to be running fine until this happened. But there was no obvious signs that it broke a ringland or anything. Couldn't figure it out. Pulled it apart. Found out I had broken all the pistons. But what's even greater is that if you look at the bearings, there's almost no wear at all for being only a couple miles put on the motor. Or the engine, I should say. There's a couple of bearings that have these lines in them here that you can see, but you can't feel them with your fingers, so I would run them again. I will end up running them again. Trying to decide whether I want to put 390 forged pistons in it, which I don't know what company sells those, or I could go with DSS forged pistons for a 351, and then you have to buy a bushing kit for the rod. It's around like $400-ish to do the whole swap. Don't really have $400 on hand right now, but once the money comes in and I get these changed, I'll be sure to let it rip one more time, see if it'll actually hold. I was very surprised that I broke all 6 of these pistons, because I've never really seen that happen. But these are just the regular cast hyper-uetic, however you say it, pistons. So they weren't really the best, and this motor was originally from my truck, and the owner previously told us that it had gotten hot multiple times. The head was actually warped like 20 thousandths of an inch or so, or even more. So it had gotten pretty hot a couple of times, and I kind of knew I shouldn't have reused these pistons, but I figured since it's $90 to replace these with the same style piston that's just stock, it'd be $90, but I didn't really want to spend that $90 when I could have spent about the same amount of money and put an aftermarket camshaft in it, which I also did not do. Whenever this goes back in, it will be switched over to a trigger wheel, which I do have, and I need to make a new mount for it because I know this mount won't work because it's too flimsy. This was just a little ghetto rig to see how it would all actually fit up. And I welded a little stud to the end of here, and I got a nut that'll actually perfectly center the trigger wheel onto the balancer, so I won't have any problems there. Already tested that one for mock-up. I was thinking about building my own windage pan, because it's just all open inside of there. The head seemed perfectly fine. I actually went through and did a valve job on it, and resealed all the valves, and ported the head, which worked quite well actually. But yeah, so I think I'm just gonna buy some new gaskets, some new pistons, maybe even some new connecting rods. Not sure about that yet. I would like to spin more RPM. This never did see any higher than 3750 RPM, just because the way that I have my throttle position set, it won't let it go past like 70% throttle when you're fully pressing the pedal. So I was never actually at 100% load with this engine. And since I can't go any farther than 70% with the pedal, the transmission doesn't want to actually shift any later than 3700 RPM. Whereas if I could go full throttle, the transmission would be able to see it and it would shift it around 4500, 5000 RPM-ish, depending on how I set my transmission. But I think that's gonna wrap it up for today. Gonna wait and get some new pistons in, probably some new rods. These were also cast rings. They weren't like any special ring. They were just cast stock replacement. I kind of figured that this would last a little bit longer than what it did, but seeing all the things that I could have and should have replaced while I was in here, that was definitely something I should have done. And this isn't the first motor that I've built. I've worked on many of dirt bike motors before I even started to build 4-cylinder Mazda FS engines, which is what's over here on the table. I've built one for my brother's car, and I've built a couple other ones for the race car. Done some valve work on those heads and stuff. So I know it wasn't builder error that was the cause of this, besides the ring gap size, but from the calculator that I used, 25 thousandths should have been fine for only 10 pounds of boost. I didn't want to run any more than 10 pounds of boost without upgrading the pistons or even to head studs, because I didn't buy head studs. I was just using Felpro head bolts, so I wasn't using just the regular old bolts. I did use Felpro bolts, not quite studs, but a little bit better than just the factory bolts. But besides that, this thing was ripping while it was still alive. As fast as that truck has ever gone, in my opinion. But yeah, I hope you all have a great day, and I hope you guys like to see all this carnage that happened to my motor. So I'll see you next time.